Alrighty, welcome to the recording of the Exam2 review. We did go over mostly everything in class today, but I found a better way of wording one of the concepts about looking at data to investigate confounders. So if you were in class today, you may still want to skip to the last 5 minutes of this video just to hear that talked about in a different way. All right, so to begin, just like last exam, you're going to have some R functions that you will have to match to the definition of what they do. If you know all of these functions and what they do and what their output looks like, then you will be well prepared for the exam. I highly recommend either trying to write these down and come up with an explanation for what they do on your own. If you don't know, then Google it, slap that on a flashcard, and make sure to keep rehearsing those over the weekend and right before the test. That'll help keep it fresh in your memory. So I do have a couple example questions here. Which function is used to regress one variable onto another? You're often going to see this function in a structure like some kind of name like mod1 or model, and then you're going to use this function to create that regression. And the answer to this one is LM. I hope everyone already knew that. We've been using that one a lot. If you didn't know that, make sure to go back and look at what the arguments within that function would look like and how they apply to the regression. Which functions are used to create publication-ready tables? And I asked this question in this very specific way because you'll notice that they both start with this table acronym, TBL. And so when you're thinking about what these functions do, you can at least know that the two with the TBL acronym is going to help you create publication-ready tables, and I will leave it up to you to know the difference between those. That could definitely be a place where people will get confused. There's two functions that are going to help you create publication-ready tables. Just go on back to those handouts and search for these functions to make sure you understand the difference between them. Next, which functions would you use to look at information obtained from a model? You'll often see a model fed into these functions like below. So take a moment to pause the video and see if you can guess which three functions are used to look at your information obtained from the model. It would be tidy, glance, and augment. And if you don't know the difference between those functions, I also highly recommend you go back and look at the output, make sure you understand what's happening with these functions especially, and then do review the other functions on this slide as well. There is a section on the exam about cross-tabulation, so I created this example with some fun made-up data from the Corgi parade that I went to a couple of weeks ago. I think that this is kind of fun, so I hope you all enjoy it as well. In class and here as well, I'm going to explain more about how I approach a test question like this. If you want more information on the concepts, just go back to those handouts or even Google a Khan Academy video. There's plenty of great ways to learn about the concepts, but I'm going to kind of focus on how I would look at this question on a test to help me get my right answer and double check myself. So in this case, we're looking at the Fort Collins Tour de Corgi, which had a total of 200 dogs in attendance. Some participated in the costume contest, others in the parade, some participated in both. And among these dogs, many of them are named after food like waffles, donut, and potato. Those are real names of dogs that I met. You are obsessed with dogs like me, and you want to create a cross-tabulation of the data you gathered to impress your friends. And so before even reading these numbers and the variables they're associated with, I would approach this question by thinking about the variables of interest. And so in this crosstab table that I've given you, I've showed you that food names and costume are the two things that we are interested in. And so already I can look in this question and eliminate some of these other concepts that I threw in the description on purpose to make that same kind of test question sense where you may get overwhelmed by all the information in the question. All you have to do is go to that table to help direct you to which variables you want to focus on. And so in this case, we're looking at whether dogs were in the costume contest and had food names. So other things like participating in the parade or how cute they are is not going to pertain to this question. Or what their specific names are, that's not going to matter either. And the next thing I would do is look to identify all the numbers that I might use in my answer to this problem. And so in this case, I bulleted some of the numbers for you. 80 dogs had food names, 125 dogs in costume contest, 125 dogs in costume contest and with food names. So the tricky thing about that is that you also have to go back to that very first sentence and notice the 200 total dogs in attendance. Don't let that one escape your attention just because it's not next to all the other numbers. So now that I've identified all the numbers that I need to answer this question, you can pause the video to take a moment, write down a copy of this table, and physically put in the numbers with your pen and pencil. That is the best way to solidify the learning for this kind of concept. Once you have answers that you think you are correct with, don't just go immediately to checking your answers. Take a moment to reflect on how you approached that question and how that worked for you. And so in my case, I like to approach this question by starting with the total of all the observations that we're looking at. So in this case, the total of 200 dogs in attendance. And I would go ahead and pop that in that lowest, rightmost cell of the table, where the total column meets the total row. Next, I would look at 80 dogs had food names. Then I would look at 125 dogs in the costume contest. Finally, I would use this last bit of information that of the 125 in the costume contest, 50 also had food names. Then I would use that to go ahead and do the math to answer the cells that I hadn't yet filled in. So that's how I would approach it. Take a moment to reflect and think about how you're approaching this question in the moment, because that is going to help you to be more calm on the test, to know exactly which of these micro steps you're going to do in order to answer the question. And so here are the answers for you to check your work. If you have any questions about any of these, please reach out. So for more crosstab practice, also a couple weeks ago here at CSU, there was a concert. The band Goose came to town. And at this concert, there were both students and non-students, many people wearing tie-dye in both groups. And so I've given you the crosstab table here, and I'm going to ask these questions. Now, approaching all of these questions, you can do in a similar way. What you're looking for is a numerator and a denominator. And so for each of these questions, you're going to need to think carefully about both of these pieces, because both the numerator and denominator of your answer is going to change. So what percent of all people wore tie-dye? The all people is indicating which number you should use for your denominator, and that is going to be where the total row meets the total column. That 10,000 people is the total people in attendance, so that's your denominator. What percent of them wore tie-dye? You're going to use that tie-dye row to go all the way to the total people wearing tie-dye, and you're going to divide that by the total people at the concert. And so I made these numbers pretty round, but you may find it super helpful to have a little calculator with you on the exam just to help with some slightly more tricky mental math. Highly recommend you bring one of those along. What percent of people, let's see, did I put the answer? Okay, there we go. There's our answer. What percent of people who did not wear tie-dye also were not students? And so now we're looking for our denominator as being people who did not wear tie-dye, and our numerator is people who also were not students. And so we're going to do the 5,500 who didn't wear tie-dye divided by, but the 5,000 who are not students divided by the total 5,500 that did not wear tie-dye. What percent of people are students and wore tie-dye? I think you can see where I'm going with this. You're going to take that number of students wearing tie-dye and divide by the total number of people. Now things get a little more tricky. Among students, what percent wore tie-dye? This is your key to know that we are no longer using 10,000 in the denominator. We're only looking at the subgroup of students. So you're going to use the total students as your denominator and the number of students that wore tie-dye as the numerator. And finally, this was a really tricky question. Even as TAs discussed how do we remember how these and or operators work within a question like this. And I think it's confusing because in English, we can use the word or to mean either or. You might see it written and/or if you want to be inclusive of both groups. And so I will just tell you now, in this kind of context, when we're talking about logical operators and statistics, you can think of it as being and/or. And so when you're calculating what percent of people are either students or wore tie-dye, you're still going to use that 10,000 for the denominator. We're talking about what percent of all the people. And then to determine if someone falls in the group of either students or wore tie-dye, you're going to start with the cell of students that did wear tie-dye, 1,500. You're going to include the cell of students that did not wear tie-dye because they're still students. That's the 500. You're also going to include the non-students who wore tie-dye, the 3,000. And it's important to add it up in this way because if you just used the totals, you would be double counting those students that wore tie-dye, and you only want to count them once. And so you're going to take that 2,000, which is the 1,500 plus 500, and you're just adding the 3,000 non-students that wore tie-dye. Be careful not to look at the column of total tie-dye wearers because that is, again, double counting those students. Okay, and then you'll get your numerator. You divide that by your denominator, which we said was 10,000, and there is your answer. Please let the TAs know if you have any questions on logical operators. Next, we talked about all different kinds of studies, and it's important to be able to identify these, the different types in the wild, so to speak. I honestly think this is one of the most important concepts in the class for your life. Even if you were to not learn anything else in this class, understanding the difference between causal, descriptive, and predictive studies is super important just for your ability to synthesize and read the information that's coming to you from all different kinds of sources. So in this case, I measure cognitive effort in older adults with multiple cognitive tasks and self-reports to investigate changes in cognitive effort expenditure related to age. And you might already be thinking, how am I going to approach this question? I didn't use the word describe, cause, or predict in this example because I wanted you to think a little bit harder about the kinds of elements of the study that you're going to consider when determining what kind of study it is. And so in this case, the key word here would be to investigate changes in cognitive effort expenditure related to age. And in this case, I'm just investigating these relationships and describing them. So this example would be a descriptive study. I also analyze cognitive task data to determine if specific aspects of cognition can predict functional outcomes for participants with schizophrenia. Now, oftentimes in the description of the study, you will see one of these words. And if you're like me, you might think that's way too easy. I should second guess myself. Just because it says predict, maybe they're trying to trick me. We are not trying to trick you. If it says predict, then you can take all the information in the question and make sure that you understand whether this is a predictive study. And if they are using the word predict, it is almost definitely going to be a predictive study. Just make sure you read carefully to catch these important words in each description. Finally, I randomly assign participants to either receive transcranial magnetic stimulation or a sham condition to investigate whether stimulation of a certain brain area impacts working memory. I test their memory before and after the treatment or sham. So here there's a few indicators. I'm looking at where it says randomly assigned participants. I am looking at the fact that there's a treatment and a control condition. And I'm looking at the pre and post test. That all suggests to me that I am looking at a causal study. I am looking to see if knocking out this brain area with TMS causes a change in memory. And interestingly, transcranial magnetic stimulation is one of the only brain methods we have where we can actually draw causal conclusions. If anyone has questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about TMS. Now, to take this one step farther, which of these variables would you expect to be equal across treatment and sham conditions? Now, remember, I have randomly assigned participants to either be in the treatment or sham condition. And so when I do a random assignment, I am not stratifying based on any other variables. I didn't even mention variables like age and sex. And so you can assume that they are likely to be close to equal across the treatment and sham conditions. Now, score on memory test before treatment and sham conditions would also hopefully be equal in both groups, because if I somehow selected all the people with a better memory score for the on the precondition, then it's not going to tell me anything when their memory score goes up or down for the post condition. The random assignment is what we're looking for to ensure that those pretest conditions are going to be equal between groups. However, the score on the memory test after treatment and sham conditions would hopefully not be the same, because that is exactly the variable that I am trying to change with the treatment. And to take this even into the realm of confounding variables, we could say that a research assistant has a bunch of friends and has assigned them all to the treatment condition. Is being friends with the researcher a confounding variable? And so when you see a question about a confounding variable, you want to ask yourself, what question am I asking about this variable to know if it is a confounding variable? And the question you may already have in your mind, I hope you do, is, does this variable cause both X and Y, the predictor and the outcome? Is this variable causing both? Now, in this case, I made this question a little tricky, because we can see that being friends with the researcher is confounding one of these variables. It is causing, I should say, one of these variables. All of your friends are now in the treatment condition. But assuming that all of your friends are of equal pre-memory scores, this would not be considered a confounding variable, because it is not going to also cause the outcome, the Y, which in this case is the post-test memory score. I know that can be tricky to wrap your head around, so please reach out if you have any questions about that. To take it one step further and change the question, We say that the same researcher who assigned all her friends to the treatment group also leaves the answers to the memory test in front of participants, and none of the other researchers do that. Now, being friends with this researcher has both caused you to be in the treatment group, and it has probably caused you to have a higher score on that post-memory test because you have the answers right in front of you. So now friendship with the researcher could be considered a confounding variable because it's causing both. Next, I'm going to talk about residuals. This has been a concept that is really tricky for a lot of students, and so if you are still unclear on this concept, please reach out for help and make sure to review it. It is going to be on the exam. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to handout 6. But before I use that example, I want you to know that when you see a question about a residual, there are 2 things that you need. You need the predicted y and the actual y. And your whole process is just about how to get the predicted y and the actual y. And so we're going to step through this in just a second, but as a reminder, your predicted y, also known as y hat, equals b0, the intercept, plus b1, the slope, for x1 times x1, and then you can add as many other variables in that manner as you choose. So if you had 2 predictors, then you would just have a second slope and your second x value. On the other hand, your actual y is going to be the value at y for any given value of x. This is the observation that was actually made in the data.